Hi, Barry. Welcome to our podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Barry from Organic Architect, you're the managing director. And Organic Architect, they specialize in creating beautiful, eco-friendly, sustainable distilleries. And you have worked with many founders and owners of the distilleries. So I've been following your content on LinkedIn, and it's been great, what you share, beautiful images and some videos. So I thought, we'll have you as our guest, as idea, work with a lot of distillery clients, and it'd be good to understand. So tell us more about Organic Architect.
So Organic Architects started by Gareth and Andrea, I think 12, 13, 14 years ago, maybe. Mm-hmm. We kind of did a bit of everything. And, like from kind of housing, we did a nursery design, all kinds of things. And then just by chance, we were working on a biomass heat pump for a castle. Okay. And then one of the owner of the castle was one of the backers for the Ardnamurchan distillery project. So they kind of said, would you like to kind of put a proposal forward for that?
And how long ago was it, sorry?
That must be 12 plus years ago, because Ardnamurchan have just released their 10-year-old. So they've been in production for 10 years. So
I hope they sent you nice bottles.
Yeah, we've certainly got plenty in the office. Good. So then, after that, Ardnamurchan was really one of the first kind of new distilleries to be built. Like a lot of guys like yourselves would have been involved in retrofitting distilleries or kind of replacing individual bits of kit or whatever, but nobody was really building new distilleries at that point. I think Killoman was perhaps around the same time as Ardnamurchan, but so when you were going into it completely fresh, like when we were speaking to the process designers for that, it was like, we've not done this, we've not done a new one, so. It was kind of, everybody was learning along the way, and then off the back of that, I think once you've done one, more inquiries follow, and certainly, the increase in Scotch whisky distilleries in the last 10 years has been pretty substantial. So there's been loads of inquiries in there. I think people, you're investing a lot of money in a distillery, so if somebody's done it before, then
it gives you
you've learned a lesson.
And
I think Ardnamurchan was that, and then Nicnean and Lindor's kind of came along a few years after that. They were around the same time, so that was actually when I joined Organic. So I moved from a practice in Edinburgh to Organic to run Lindor's distillery on site, whilst Gareth was working on Nicnean on site. So that was a good, I think, about 18 months on site. Just completely different to anything I'd done before. I was used to doing residential. Sure. So you're going into a meeting with, it's yourselves, maybe a structural engineer, maybe not, and the client and the contractor. That's kind of it. And then you go to a distillery site, and you've got process guys. There was the electrical side of that. There was the mechanical side of that. You've got so many different consultants sitting around the table. So kind of, it's a big step up to managing a team of that kind of size. But that's what I thought, it was a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to go and do it. If you don't like it, you can always go back to doing what you were doing. But it seemed like a good move to step
I think
over
that what stood out for me when I've been following Organic Architects for now last 2-3 years, and all the branding has been around obviously specialist craft distilleries, beautiful, eco-friendly, sustainable. So at what point did you decide as a company, as a business, transitioning and pivoting on that market?
Well, I think it was probably 4 or 5 years ago that we made a real conscious step into doing it, because up to that point we were still doing a bit of everything, but it's kind of difficult to, you can't have a small extension on your website for somebody who wants to invest millions of pounds in a new distillery. It's a completely different thing. So I actually worked with a copywriter who to really kind of refine the messaging and everything. But the they're really good jobs in terms of interest for an architect, because you've got the industrial side of things. So there's a whole lot of efficiency that needs to be built in there and understanding of the process. But then you've got visitor stuff. So you've got hospitality, you've got bars, restaurants, you've got offices. Like there's a kind of wide range of different types of space in a distillery. So we kind of thought, right, if we aim at that, you can always branch out from there. You can always go to, as we've done warehousing for distillers, we've done bottling halls and those type of kind of ancillary buildings. But I think it's people want you to be focused on what they're doing as well. So like we get involved, we go to industry events, like we have meetings with all kinds of consultants to really try and improve our own knowledge, because everybody does it differently. You work with master distillers, and if you get 3 of them around the table, you've got 3 completely different opinions on how something should be done.
Objectivity, so no, completely get it.
Trying to understand that's the case as well. And, now we can say to a distiller, right, these people did it this way, these guys did it this way. There's, everything in between is there. But it's just, I think as an architect, getting a kind of deep understanding of all of the things that feed into it will make a better building in the end. It's not just about a process engineer saying, here's a lump of process, put a box around it.
Yeah. I think you've done a great job, because in the last 2-3 years, I've had few interactions with you, and what prompted those interactions was that I met people who mention organic architect. So I think pivoting and transitioning to that market, and I think the number of distilleries I have seen, new distillery projects, whether it's craft distilleries or resurrecting old distilleries in the last 10 years, I don't think prior to that I heard so frequently, new distillery projects coming. So this is in Scotland. You mentioned some distilleries in Ireland. What about internationally? Have you gone beyond the shores?
Yeah, like we've had inquiries from around the world, really. And sometimes it's just trying to figure out what's the right kind of service that we can provide there. Mm-hmm. So we did one design which we basically took up to what we would say is like kind of planning stage, and then handed it over to a local team. Yeah. We've never heard about it again. No idea if it's been built. But they kind of wanted a Scotch distillery. Other ones now we're looking at the moment that the client kind of wants more involvement for us. So we're just trying to figure out how we can actually properly service that. I think like the design for those ones is amazing. Like completely different considerations in terms of like your kind of your ventilation for the process and all the things that in Scotland kind of work with the climate, and you can do a lot of passive or natural solutions when you've got like 30, 40, 50 degrees Celsius. There's a whole host of different considerations. So it's been really interesting.
But also I take it understanding and learning their own culture and traditions, and how you might want to integrate that with the traditional Scottish production process, because end of the day, they are looking for a Scottish distillery or Scotch whiskey, or products similar to Scotch whiskey, but being produced in their own country.
Well, I think there's kind of 2 different approaches that we've seen. Is that either we've had some that come through the door and say, right, we want a Scottish distillery to produce Scotch. Doesn't matter that it's in a completely different country, and like to the extent where they would be looking to import grain from Scotland. Whereas other ones, as you say, they want something that's a blend between a Scottish distillery, but it does take account of the kind of local style and all those considerations that we kind of take for granted. So there's always a responsibility from our side of like we effectively design to like our Scotch rules. So in terms of like what we know about the process, the kind of health and safety issues around that. So off the bat, we will be designing with those things in mind, but there's always another level of local kind of considerations.
No, that's I think we often, at IDEA as process designers, we find the same challenges, that you have to be aware of local regulation and standards. And I'm sure many people, when they think of architecture, they are thinking about nice, beautiful design, but there's an architectural engineering side of things as well, which needs to comply with local regulations and standards, which in the UK, I'm sure a lot of European, British standards are followed, while if you go to other parts of the world, then you're obviously, so when you obviously specialist distillery architect, and when companies come to you, and new founders, you're working with them, you also could have different stakeholders who want different things out of the discussion. So you could have a brand ambassador who is really passionate about the brand. You could have the owner who's thinking about, obviously I want to make it sustainable, efficient, what's going to be my running cost. Do they come to you and you feel that they are basically expecting all the answers from what seems to be the one branch that accounts towards the overall distillery design aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do, but our part of our role is what we describe as being the lead consultant on a job. So if you're particularly brand focused, but you've not really done anything with that yet, then we can put you in touch with an agency that can kind of feed in from that side. Or if it's process, we can recommend that you go and speak to these people, because I say like it's always done differently. Everybody's got their own opinion. Everybody's got their own drivers. So you never have one or two clients who have got the same opinion about how much it needs to be about brand or how much it needs to be about process. So it's just about assembling the right team that can give the good advice that client is actually going to get the most out of. And I think that's being in the industry and learning who all those people are, what their background is. You can start to fit people with the right clients. Yeah. And that's a big part of our job, is that we kind of tender the work of other consultants, but it's always, we have interviews with the client to make sure that
they are involved in the process.
Yeah, and you want, these projects take a long time. Yeah. So you want to have a team where you get on with the people in that team and you trust the people in that team to give you the right advice. And I think that's where we've got to now in terms of like the experience that we've got. We can say to people off the bat, right, that's not a good approach, or your budget isn't going to cover what your aspirations are. And just kind of knowing that and being confident to tell people that as well. I think people sometimes like the hard truths.
Yeah. I think the two main costs of any distillery projects, if I have to broadly categorize them, there's a building aspect. Obviously, everything that's going to house all the process. Visitor center, which again could have the bar areas and visitor experience. So when you look at the cost of the building versus the cost of the actual process that you have to put in place to produce whiskey or to store whiskey, what is the kind of, if you have to tell our audience and anybody who is considering of starting a distillery, would you have a gut feel for what that cost roughly looks like in terms of the proportion?
I think when we started, it was roughly kind of 1-to-1.
Okay.
What you would say. But I think the dynamic of that has completely changed because you've got much more complex equipment available. So if you want to bring in like your TVR or your MVR, whatever, there's a kind of step in the costs. Mm-hmm. So you're not just buying a standard set of equipment anymore. And similarly with the buildings, is you can build a low spec shed to house that equipment, but then does that do the things of the branding, and does it feed into everything else that you need out of that building? So you can end up spending like £7,000 to £10,000 per square meter on high-end visitor buildings, but £2,000 a square meter on a production building. Yeah, and it's a difficult thing to pin down now, I think, because there's so many variables, and people will look to phase things a bit more than perhaps they did in the past, so that we've got clients at the moment who are building production first.
Revenue stream is there.
So you can start to lay down casks. You can finance those, or you can attract investment to then build a visitor facility when you're ready to sell. So there's a lot more. I think, like I had this conversation with Gareth recently, is that there's a lot more nuance in terms of what clients' understanding is, because now we've had a lot of distilleries built in the last 10 years. So you can see there's a good strategy. Those guys have got that right, or that didn't quite work out, and they've spent a lot of money that they didn't necessarily have to on day one. So I think the lessons are there now for people to kind of understand, and clients out there are much better kind of educated and much more focused on what their approach is going to be.
That's interesting. So when you talk about the building aspect, there could be two scenarios. One is it's a completely greenfield site and you have to build a building, or it could be utilizing an old structure which is being repurposed. How do you navigate the challenges? Well, obviously having a blank sheet as an architect would be your preference?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's so much quality in an old building that you wouldn't necessarily be able to kind of recreate. Yeah. So, like, we've got Castletown Mill on site at the moment up in Thurso, and that's like a B-listed mill building, which has just got the most amazing stonework. It's got oak trusses. It's got Caithness slabs on the roof. It's just like things that you'd never really consider doing on a new building. And there's so much quality in that. But then the flip side is that it can be a lot more expensive to, like you think, oh, well, we've got floors and we've got walls. And I mean, we had a part of a roof there. But the costs involved in actually kind of getting that building back up to scratch, to then, making it able to take the process. There's like mills are actually quite good because you've generally got some big spaces. So, the bigger bits of kit can kind of find homes that don't need too much alterations. But I don't really have any preference. I think like if you've got a nice old building, that can start to feed into all of your brand messaging kind of early on. You can build a story behind that. If you've got a new one, similarly, like you can kind of set your own story. So
going back to your company's mission, and it is a lot more focus on sustainability and eco-friendly aspect of it, and that I take it you can embed those best practices in the building design as well as in the process itself that you're setting up. In terms of looking at the key aspects that you generally focus on when the focus is on the sustainability, what are those key things that you discuss with your clients when you're, in the concept stage?
I mean, like really the biggest consideration for the whole project is always the fuel. What's your fuel source? If you get that right, everything else kind of falls into place. In terms of the buildings, like I think we did a calculation once and we worked out that the building itself was responsible for like 3 to 5% of the overall kind of carbon footprint. So even the most efficient building doesn't really touch the sides with a distillery because of the energy demands on the process. So it's trying to make the best of it. Like what we always try and do is recapture some of the heat from the process to heat your building. So traditionally you've got distilleries which are heating up and cooling down vast quantities of liquid all of the time, and it's quite, if you think about it, it's quite inefficient. So if you can get some, instead of sending it to a cooling tower, if you can bring that in and use it in the building for your hot water and your underfloor heating or those kind of things, then you've got free heating effectively for your building. But as like Ardnamurchan, they set out, they had trees on site so they could make their own biomass. It's probably not the best distilling fuel as such because it's suitable for kind of low, long periods of energy, but they had that free fuel source effectively. the one that we've just completed over in Ireland, Haskra, they've got a heat pump system, which was like the client came from a pharmaceutical background, and he knew of that technology, and everyone in distilling kind of said, "Oh, it'll never work. You can't make it work with a distillery."
Sure.
And he's got it working, and his fuel cost, the capital costs of that were big, but he also got help with that from the Irish government. But then his operational costs are tiny compared to other distilleries. So
I think that's we have seen inquiries in the last 2 years, which if I have to categorize the number of projects we are doing, I think I would say almost 20-25% are in and around decarbonization, path to net zero, and working with these clients and understanding their challenges, whether it's a major distillery client or a small distillery. I think we did a bit of a sort of interview of the people who are key decision makers in the field when it comes to when they are thinking about transitioning to greener fuel currency or making their systems more efficient. And we thought, what's the best way to present this? And we came up with this sort of triangle where if you look at one corner of the triangle, it's the quality of the spirit. You shouldn't compromise. So, for instance, I think I know the project you're mentioning in Ireland, and obviously they took a conscious decision that we can use high temperature hot water to, for the purpose of heating. But if somebody has been producing a single malt whiskey with a steam at certain pressure, with certain distillation times, and you ask them to change their philosophy, you'll be challenged because that can apparently affect the quality of the spirit.
Yeah.
So when we are looking at that triangle, I think the quality of the spirit is quite important, especially if it's an existing brand. I think the second key aspect, if you look at the second corner of the triangle, is the constraints that site can naturally have, or the opportunities that site naturally have. And these could be spatial, because if it's an existing distillery, you could have spatial constraints, what you can put, what you can't put. You talked about heat pumps. It could be electrical constraints, because some remote part of the Scotland, it's not easy to upgrade the electrical infrastructure. So if you are looking at electrification as being one of the potential opportunities, you're limited by how much power you have to do that, to transition. And I think the third aspect is the capex and the opex. Obviously, you need to be aware of the grants and the funding that you can locally have available as a potential opportunity to bring down your capex. If you're setting up a new plant or you're thinking of embedding any efficient systems, and looking at the operating costs, how do you justify return on investment? What does that do to your per liter production of alcohol? And I think it's good. You touched on the point about the fuel currency, that what fuel are you actually using if you want to transition. We have recently looked at how we can actually reduce the energy that is needed in the first place as well. And I think those two things go hand in hand, because traditionally you're used to sort of, obviously everything that's getting heated is being cooled, and you put it through the cooling tower, because historically the gas prices have been low. There hasn't been much pressure, from legislation point of view when you look at the emissions, but now there's a lot more focus. So, all these companies are thinking about it. So along with the fuel currency, if you can also reduce the demand of energy in the first place, and that kind of complements quite well. And sometimes if you look at that triangle, it makes the capex versus the opex argument more attractive, because you're saying that I now need less. But you're right. I think there's no one size fits all. It depends on the site specific constraints. It depends on what client can afford to put, and all these challenges when you're working needs to be taken into account. So
I think you're right. Like a lot of the time, if we're working with a new distillery, as you say, like they don't have a spirit character as such that they need to be achieving. So they're working from scratch. Yeah. So if it's, you know, it doesn't really matter effectively what's going on. But then, like, there's the big kind of PLCs, like, they're never going to want to change anything. And that, like, one of my things is that it must have happened in the past. Like, when all of those distilleries were kind of independently owned, and, you know, the technology changed to like your shell and tube condensers or whatever, like, people got them because it saved them money.
Yeah.
Nobody thought, oh, well, it's going to give me a different character or spirit. They just thought, well, this is cheaper to run, let's do it. But now you've got the interest of big corporations who are like, oh, well, if it changes slightly, you know, if the colour's not exactly the same, all of those things, you know, like the kind of, it's a different game altogether, I think. Because in the past, the people would have just gone, all right, well, let's just do that. Doesn't matter what impact it has. We'll find out in 20 years what character, you know, what it's done to the spirit. So there's a lot more nuance in that as well. But I think what we are doing more often is, you know, if we've got clients who, because everyone needs to move to net zero.
Yeah.
Like, it's an industry commitment. So if you can't afford to do it on day one, you need to have your pathway set out. You know, there's you have to give that to.
Yeah.
But that impacts on the building as well. So previously we would look at distilleries and people say, right, oh, we want to start a production of X, you know, 200,000 litres or whatever. And in year 5, we want to step up. So it's like, do you leave room for extra washbacks or a second mash tun, or increasing the size of the mash tun, or, you know, room for more stills and all those kind of things. And so you can end up building a much bigger building than you need on day one for the future. But then it's whether that future ever comes.
Yeah.
And then the same, you know, like if you're looking at MVR, that's got a bigger spatial requirement, you know, in terms of height and floor area. So do you build that into your distillery on day one, even if you're not bringing that technology in?
Yeah.
You know, like, so there's lots of considerations, and that's why I think when clients are looking at it, if they've got an idea of how they want to go, because at the moment, like, you've got brands are making it like a kind of USP that they're low energy or net zero or whatever, that, but in 10 years time, that's not going to be a USP, because everyone's committed to hitting net zero. So you need to have more behind it as well. It can't just be, we've got the most efficient plant in the country.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I worked on, when I used to work with William Grant & Sons, I was one of the project engineers on Hendrick's Gin Palace, which has so much focus on branding, creating a beautiful gin palace. And it was often in the meetings, I could see the frustration between the architect wanting the thing certain way, you know, keeping brand in mind, and different stakeholders having different, so engineers really wanting, you know, to do things and lay out things a certain way, because, you know, from a technical point of view, it needs to follow certain principles. So when you are a lead consultant and an architect, and you have, you know, engineers asking you to do things a certain way, you have civil and structural designers asking you to do certain way, while your brand or owner of the, how do you manage the expectation?
It's a constant battle. But like, I think the thing is, we appreciate that, like, everybody's got their place at the table. Like, everyone's an expert in their own field. So it's trying to get the balance. Like, we're trying to be the middleman and balance out everybody's requirements. So, you know, like, obviously our own requirements for making nice buildings and making efficient buildings and cost-effective buildings and all of those things. But it is, like, it's one of the things that I think, like, engineers, like, no offense, but like, your job is to make it as efficient as possible. Sometimes that might not work in terms of the visitor journey through the building, or, you know, as you say, like, the kind of brand aspects of it. So, but if we understand the principles, then we can kind of say to you, right, we know this isn't 100% efficient, but it might be like 95. So you can kind of, you know, like, you can tweak it around the different, everybody's considerations to get the best overall. but it's and that's one of the reasons. Like, we go and visit lots of distilleries, we speak to master distillers, because like there's a very different approach from somebody who's designing the process to somebody who has run a process and been like on the ground kind of. So you got to try and balance all those opinions in the room. Sometimes it's somebody has to be disappointed.
Yeah. Well, would you say that somebody who has never seen this process through new founders, and when they see this and there's constant changes happening, do you think that's like one of the biggest challenges you see them, or they quite enjoy this journey of getting to a point where, you know, everybody's aligned and working to a common goal?
Well, I think sometimes they would just like to come in and say, right, I want a distillery, and you go, here you go, there's your distillery.
Surely that never happens.
But no, I think that's what they would want to happen.
Yeah.
But there's so many moving parts, and like you've got the other, you know, like we're talking about the kind of practical side of things and the branding side of things, but then you've got also all the considerations with the local plan, and you know, as your distillery in a green field, like much harder to get permission for, perhaps, you know, so that like there's a whole raft of considerations, and that's, you know, sometimes we go through with a client, right, here's all the things that we need to do to even get to planning.
Yeah.
And it's huge. It's big costs involved sometimes, depending on reports that are needed. But most of them are quite, you know, they understand that what they're doing isn't an easy thing.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different boxes to tick. So
I think as an architect, planning permission is a huge milestone, because obviously when people come to you right at the very start with a concept that they have in their mind to create this distillery, and then obviously you start laying out the process, working with other consultants, bringing everything together to then take it to a point where when it's going to council for the planning permission, it's being submitted, things become more real, and you have, they have had a chance to think about the different aspects. If, again, anybody listening and thinking of starting a new distillery, what do you see? How do you navigate that, you know, path to, you know, submitting a planning permission and hopefully being successful in obtaining the planning permission?
Planning is probably the biggest milestone, you know, apart from switching on the stills, because what we find is that a lot of the time projects will be funded either by the client or by that business
investors
up to planning.
Yeah.
And then once you've got your planning, you can then get, you know, your investors are much more interested when it becomes a serious project with planning permission, or if you're getting grants or whatever, they always want, you know, you don't get very far in the application process until you've got planning in place. So it is a huge kind of milestone. And I say, like, there's costs associated with that. What we always try and do is we'll try and see there's a certain number of reports that you need to do at distillery.
Yeah.
You know, like ground investigations, noise and odor reports, but, you know, like there's as many reports as you can think of. You'll need to do one for a distillery. So it's trying to figure out what are the critical things for the planners, like what can you get approved,
Sure.
Without needing to make that spend. Because you can, if you do everything off the bat, you know, you're spending potentially tens of thousands of pounds that you might not need to at that point. So it's just trying to kind of figure out what are the risks for the project in terms of the legislation and, you know, questions that are going to be asked versus what you need to do in the longer term, because most of those reports you need to do.
Sure.
But you want, like, I always think with our planning system, with the way it is, they could have a different approach in terms of they could give you the principle for development and then say, if all of these things line up, then yes, you can get permission. But what they do is they say, give us all of these things and then we'll decide if we give you permission or not. So you have to make a huge investment on, sometimes, you know, if a site's never going to be viable for one reason and you've had to do 25 reports, 24 of those reports are wasted because one of them doesn't, you know. So it's just kind of trying to understand clients' attitude to risk and, you know, us advising of what we see as the real big risks in the project for achieving that planning.
And what about the public consultation? Because obviously, whenever you're setting up a production plant, you have to take into account the local community, and you have to kind of take them along with you and get their buy-in as
Yeah.
well. Is that a challenging process?
It can be. I mean, I think the good thing with distilleries is that you've got distilleries that have been in towns for like hundreds of years, or like you've got like Oban is right in the center of town.
Yeah.
Most of Isla, like it's not. I think as soon you're right when you say a distillery, I think people immediately go to some a huge like Invergordon or something, like some big production plant. But the reality is, especially on a kind of smaller scale, like there's not really much noise or nuisance generated from them. The biggest issue in terms of planning and people's worries are usually vehicle movements and like bringing the public into places that they wouldn't necessarily be before. But I think the distilleries, or a lot of the ones that we've worked on especially, are like they engineer themselves into being a kind of community centre almost. Like Arnhem did really good things in terms of like they sponsored some school kids and gifted casks to
Giving
as
it
a
back
kind
to
of higher
community.
education grant. And like Lindors hosts a lot of like community events in the courtyard and things like that. So people, like once they're there, people really can see how much of an advantage they can bring, because the jobs, like in these locations. I'm from the Isle of Mull, and like I really understand the kind of the microeconomics of these places. So if you can create 6, 10, 15 skilled full-time jobs, that's a massive, massive benefit for those places. But it's just getting past that. It's not going to be chucking out loads of smoke or smells or
noisy cooling towers.
Yeah, exactly.
Try to hide them.
Yeah, but that's
Chuck them
like,
away.
but there's always a kind of technical solution to those things. But you're right. You've got to bring the public in and kind of say, right, this is what we want to do it. This is why we want to do it. It's for the benefit of everyone. It's not just like a rich corporation coming in and making the most out of your nice places. Everyone wants to add to the area, and people want to put distilleries in these lovely locations because people, it's an attraction to kind of to bring people there.
So what's next for Organic Architects? I mean, I can see a bit of kind of plateau happening in the UK, in Scotland. Do you think you'll be seeing a lot more international opportunities? And so what have you got in mind to, grow Organic Architect?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely still opportunities in Scotland. Like we're still got a lot of work that's coming in from Scotland. As it tends to be much more serious inquiries, if you like. But certainly, like some in England, that seems to be another kind of emerging market. Ireland still, Ireland seems to go through phases with us, is that we get a kind of few inquiries through, and then nothing, and then a few more. So there's that, and then I say like there's other international opportunities, but I think we're quite well placed because we're Scottish doing a Scottish thing.
Yeah.
And that's it's you're at the kind of top of the market. Everyone looks at whiskey and immediately thinks of Scotch.
Yeah.
So it's trying to kind of to build on that and expand on that. I think like North America as well. We've had some inquiries from North America to look at single malt production over there, which is a really interesting space. I think like there's some mad stat that I think there's more distilleries in New York State than there are in Scotland.
Wow.
And you think, like nobody thinks of New York State as a distilling area. But
I mean, our next guest is the CEO of English Whiskey Guild.
Right.
Yeah, in
Is that
December.
Morag?
Yeah, so Morag is coming on our podcast. So I'm sure she'll be telling us all about, English whiskey and the future plans. Because as you said, there are 40 odd distilleries in England, and I think there's a huge investment in the pipeline.
I think and it's a really interesting space because they they don't need to do things the way that we need to do
Yes.
things in Scotland. But I think that there's a bit of a dilemma, I think, sometimes of you can do it differently, but do you want, like, can you compete with making Scotch somewhere that's not Scotland?
Yeah.
Or do you do something that's completely different with different casks, different grains, all that kind of stuff? So there's lots more opportunity, but I think the market is probably more difficult.
Yeah, I was in India 2 weeks ago, and I was speaking to a couple of potential clients, and it's amazing that the amount of international companies who've primarily been identified with Scotch whiskey in Scotland, being produced in Scotland, and now thinking of setting up distilleries in India, partly because of the import duties, and if you're producing locally, then you can add to, and so there's huge opportunities. What's happening in Japan, China, you hear about the expansions all the time. So lastly, if you have to give an advice to somebody new thinking of setting up a distillery, we'll finish on that. What would that be?
I think it's just to, if you've got a location, that's the thing that will determine everything about your distillery. Like it feeds into the brand, it feeds into, like all of your process stuff, it feeds into your visitors. Like if you've got a city centre location and you can cash flow from visitors, then, that's where you can put your money. If you're in a rural location and you just want to make some whiskey and not really shout about it, there's lots of different considerations. So I think the best projects we've seen are clients who've had clear kind of ideas, like they always develop the ideas, but if you come in at the outset and say, right, this is the kind of aim for what we want to do, then everything can kind of fall into place behind that. I think it's that initial kind of strategy is the critical bit.
That's great. Bari, thank you so much, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.